journey to these shores has not been easy, to put it simply. Storms at sea, quarrels aboard the ship, illness spreading. But your hopes begin to soar a little as you see English-built structures ahead after miles of savage, untamed shoreline. You've reached the budding settlement of Jamestown, here to make your fortune with a profitable and rapidly growing tobacco plantation. Aware of tensions with the local natives beyond the settlement, you're wary and know it will not be easy. You think about your situation, so far from home in merry old England. Is this Virginia Company venture truly viable? You wonder what the future holds in store. Maybe this will end up another lost colony, like Roanoke a few decades before. To the south, the Popish Spaniards have already colonized broad swaths of land. Maybe this is finally England's chance to check them and start a little empire of its own. Play with the big dogs. Perhaps you're just among the first waves of settlers and colonists in this strange new land, and one day many more will come, for whatever reasons they have. You can see the appeal. Things will certainly be different in this place. Opportunity calls and fortunes may be made. This is a brave new world, and maybe being one of the first here means you will be among the ones to influence what it becomes.
Welcome to another Charlie and Andrei podcast. We have a special guest here, and we're also at a special location in Washington, D.C. in Georgetown. I'm Charlie, this is Andrei, and our special guest is, how about you introduce yourself?
Hi, this is Chris. My friends call me Bear. Well, I guess I got a lot of friends in the audience, so.
Bear man.
Good to have you here. Good to have you here. We've known Bear for quite a few years. Bear went to St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. Studied the classics, ancient Greek, French, and is an aficionado of languages and linguistics. And especially Spanish, where he has spent at least a year, if I'm not mistaken, right? Working, doing volunteer work of some nature or teaching?
2 years.
2 years teaching, wow.
Overseas in Spain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I spent a couple of years over there. I've spent about 10 years working on this language, and even my current job, I work in a ceviche restaurant, so it's all-day immersion, so here you go.
Perfect.
All right.
Well, to kind of kick us off on today's topic, I'll just say I happen to have this book in front of me. We don't have to reference it much. It's called Albion Seed, Four British Folkways in America by David Hackett Fischer. And we could certainly go into the thesis of the book, but one thing that's interesting is how he talks about 4 different speech patterns that came from England, and the 4 patterns would be, in chronological order, the Puritans, who went to Massachusetts Bay Colony. They had a very specific way of speaking from East Anglia. The Cavaliers that came from the South Country, they speak in sort of what became the Southern American accent, very slow.
Like Virginia,
elite indentured
Carolina,
services.
that kind of Georgia.
Yeah. The third wave was the Quakers, who ended up in Philadelphia.
Pennsylvania, some of Jersey, some of the mid-Atlantic.
Yes, and they continue to influence Midwestern accents quite a bit, and finally the Scotch-Irish wave that
more in Appalachia and that area, and like the hinterlands, like the kind of rural areas.
It's not the primary focus of this book, but it's one of the folkways that the book distinguishes thing, and that led us down to a conversation that we had off air. That was interesting. We thought we might turn it into a podcast about linguistics, different speech patterns.
Stuff.
Yeah.
You want to get started with kind of just like outlining some of the major kind of patterns of migration.
Yeah. So
East Anglia, for example, being an origin.
Yes.
I think what was it? That they discussed like early Anglo-Saxon settlement, the Angles in particular.
Yes, the Dane law.
Later, the Vikings arrived. The Dane law was in that area, and then what supposedly that led to a very specific kind of
sort of a high-pitched, what we would call a Yankee accent. came over from England. It existed as an accent, dialect of English, and then it came over through the Puritans, and they had a unique way of speaking. They would have like this high pitched voice. You don't really hear it much in New England these days, but you might hear it like in the hills of New Hampshire or something.
Makes sense.
And it's interesting, you know. Some of them are the way they drop their H's or R's, like I packed my con, yeah, you know, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Was very distinctive in that accent. And one thing that the book focuses on, even if you're not genetically related to these English settlers, the idea is you sort of adopt their culture by assimilating into America. And fundamentally, there's these 4 patterns.
But this also affected things other than accent, right? Like they argue that Puritans, like the communal kind of nature, the meeting houses, what are influenced by the thing, the all things,
yes,
the Danelaw and whatnot, and more.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's worthy just to quote a brief sentence from this book. It says, the organizing question here is about what might be called the determinants of a voluntary society. The problem is to explain the origins and stability of a social system which for 2 centuries has remained stubbornly democratic in its politics, capitalist in its economy, libertarian in its laws, individualist in its society. And he says basically there's 3 theories. There's one that's a genetic theory, which is probably not true at all. There's the environmental theory, and 3, this migration model. And he says that he's combining all of these, but not sticking to the genetics. He's sort of doing a dialectical assimilation.
Just to clarify, so he's looking to find the reason or source of the social system which is currently governing the United States, or at least, you know, kind of a foundation.
Yeah, he's trying to figure out what the determinants. Why did we end up having this capitalist, libertarian, democratic system that we live in? That's very pluralistic in culture.
Okay.
Which of these 4 became the most influential out of all of them, or is it just some?
Well, it's sort of a balance of all of them. He's qualitative and empirical in his analysis. So I think someone like Francis Bacon would be happy that he's using an empirical approach.
The first empiricist.
Yeah. He has these 4 waves that we just mentioned, and he has like these things called folkways, which are very empirical. So he focuses a lot on speechways, which is what we're trying to focus on here. Conventional patterns of written and spoken language, pronunciation, vocabulary, syntax, and grammar. And he's pointing out how they're different in all these 4 patterns. Of course, like you said, there's building ways, there's gender ways, there's ways they deal with death, there's religious ways. Of course, the Quakers are very different from the Cavaliers, who are almost like Anglo-Catholic in a way.
Yeah. Episcopalian.
So it's interesting because nowadays we almost have like what might be called a received pronunciation, because, you know, the CBS accent is sort of our BBC accent.
Sure. I mean, RP, or received pronunciation, specifically used in a context of British English, but I guess
analogously, yeah.
Midwestern American accent is probably the thing that influenced the general standard one that people speak, the one that doesn't really have much of an accent.
Yeah,
I guess, because everything else is more organic, right?
Yeah.
Like kind of different regions: Appalachia, the South, the Northeast, the West. Although the Western accent's kind of dying, but I guess, you know, parts of Texas, old California, before things changed with new immigration patterns, and I don't know, like Colorado, Montana, that kind of thing.
Yes.
I think it's interesting to think about like certain phonetic patterns that came to the New World. Like you think about like the R phoneme, right? Like I think in Scotland it's more of a rolled R.
Yes.
And in a lot of British, I guess, received pronunciation, it's more of like a silent R.
Correct. Yes.
At the end of words, like water or like
water.
Water.
Yeah, like just meant many things.
Yeah.
But we have in the United States more of an Irish R, where we pronounce like the R at the end of words, and which is also, you can draw a line from Ireland and to the United States, and it's like the shortest line from our country to the British Isles. And that's kind of shows a lot of the immigration patterns we might have had here, especially in the later phases, as your book might show. And you can also see similar patterns in the New World In Spanish as well, like a lot of the heavy immigration patterns came from Andalusia, which is in the south of Spain,
That's right.
with the Guadalquivir River, because that was the only river that came out of the south of Spain that did not go through Portugal or did not find its way through to the Mediterranean Sea. And you take a look at that, and you might think, okay, well, the Spanish were trying to counteract a large British maritime presence in the North Atlantic, so they needed to find a way to their colonies that kind of meandered its way through their blockades and whatnot.
You're talking in the 1580s, right? Well, like the Battle of the Spanish Armada and the Impresa de China, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, so there's been many wars between the Britain and the Spanish monarchy, but I think you can also see that connection of the Andalusian accent and their grammar patterns was what made the greatest impact on the New World.
Yeah.
Even the Canary Islands to this day, there's a language pattern in Spanish where they stopped using vosotros, which is
Oh wow!
yeah.
This is also not used in Latin
But they
America.
use it in like Argentina and thing, right?
No, they don't use it anywhere except in Spain.
In Spain, yeah. They use ustedes instead, right?
Exactly, and you see that, but you also find that in Canary Islands, which was the stopping place from Seville, the boats would come from Seville, stop in Cadiz, which is a little peninsula in the south west part of Spain. They would stop in the Canary Islands, and then they would go to the Americas, first stopping in the Caribbean and going to different countries. And you find that in the Canary Islands, they don't use vosotros either. So the shortest line from the Spanish language to the New World is from the Canary Islands to the New World, at the same way that the shortest line from the Great British Isles to the United States is Ireland to the New World, and they have a heavy influence in our accent and phonetics.
Absolutely. So it matters like the migration patterns where they came, like specific like kind of regions.
Yes.
Colored.
And is it fair to say that like after that initial Spanish influence of like dialect and certain speechways and patterns, that they started developing independently? Because is there
To some extent.
would you say there's a very big noticeable difference between like Mexican Spanish from Argentinian Spanish from Peruvian Spanish?
Yes, it's like very marked. Like I would definitely say that the most similar linguistic groups that are similar to Andalusian Spanish are in the Caribbean, like the Dominican Republic,
Cuban.
Puerto Rico, Cuban, Venezuelan, and maybe to a lesser extent Colombian. But from at that point it stops, and some of the immigration patterns for me would require a bit more research to understand. But you can definitely see kind of groupings of countries, right? Uruguay, Argentina, and Paraguay, they all kind of have a similar pattern.
And they have a lot of Italian influence, right?
Very much so.
Uruguay and Argentina in particular. I don't know about Paraguay as much, but
Yeah, very, very interesting. They have a very different phonetic pattern where the double L sound in the rest of Spanish, you can either make it a Y, like ya. In some places, it's like more aspirated, like a G sound, ja.
Yeah, exactly.
But in Uruguay, and Argentina, it's sha, like a SH sound in English. So you can kind of group that region. Peru and Ecuador are similar. Chile is its own phenomenon. You can group Colombia and Venezuela. And then you have Central American Spanish from maybe Paraguay to Guatemala. There's some variation in between there, and Mexican is also a slight like half brother to those regions. But Spanish is a very different language because it's not only is it very widely populated, but it's geographically spread to such a great extent. So it has a lot of varieties.
Would you say that it compares in any way, like analogously to like the variations of English? I mean, I've spent so much time trying to learn Spanish that I've spent so much time studying its mechanics. But English is its own breed. I mean, I don't know much about English history, but what little I do know, it's the only Germanic language in the British Isles, because the rest were Celtic and roots, and you have an invading language that was conquered twice
and it was conquered by the Latins, right? And it was then later conquered by the French with William the Conqueror in 1066.
Technically, the Romans were there before English arrived. They
Really?
left before English arrived, like a little bit before that.
When did English officially make its?
So the Roman legions pulled out around, like, I think they said 410 AD, and then by like 450 AD, the Anglo-Saxons started to migrate. Although they kind of been raiding the area for decades, it was kind of an opportunity. I think the legend is Vortigern, who was in King Arthur, he invited the Saxons over to deal with his rival, but then they ended up staying because they thought, like, this is a land of opportunity, and then they brought more, and then that's how.
So, okay, this is something I'm very interested in, because when you think of the French conquest of the British Isles,
the
Norman
Norman
would be
invasion of like
1066, yeah.
over
That was a lot
500
later, yeah.
years afterwards.
Correct, yes.
But like we think, I always I remember just like screwing around in Wikipedia, and I came up with the percentage, the pie chart of what English is, right? It's like almost 30% French, 30% Latin, and 30% Germanic, and then with a little bit of Greek and mix in there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But you think of like when the French came, if I'm not mistaken, the aristocracy and the commoners had a bit of a separation, right? You have a feudal society, and all the wealthy and the aristocrats are in their house. So using words like aristocratic, I just used it, or intellectual.
That's why in legal English we frequently have two phrases for things that are redundant, like assault and battery.
Mm-hmm.
It's like one is French, the other one is for the commoners or the Anglo-Saxons.
Is German one? Is the second
Although
word?
technically both those terms are of Old French origin.
I mean, fair enough, but it's, you see this pattern in legal English that you have like two terms for the same thing.
You also see it with like the names of foods, like pig is the Anglo-Saxon word, and then pork is like a French.
Right.
Wow.
So and then you have like chicken, again, the English word, and then poultry, which is a French word.
Yeah.
Cow and beef.
Yes.
From like bœuf or whatever in French. So it's interesting how
you also see, I think, a lot of words which are multisyllabic are French.
Words. The short ones tend to be the native so-called Germanic ones.
Yeah, because you have like a society that comes over and conquers all these Germanic people. You guys are uneducated, so we don't try to we can't even remove those words. So, but Haus, Buch, like those are all Germanic.
But yes, correct. Yeah.
But so I was thinking about this French influence, but now you were saying to me that the Germans came a little bit after when the Latins were about to pull out, or just...
They didn't really overlap directly. The Germans, Anglo-Saxons, like they conquered and assimilated the native Britons, the Celts, who were left to their own devices after the Roman legions retreated, because they had a lot of going on in Italy and Gaul and stuff, so they had other,
How do you think those languages end up fusing? I can maybe see...
Well, they fused only because French later came in the 11th century, and it's complicated. I don't know how detailed they want to get, but like French is a Romance language. Part of it evolved naturally from Latin. Part of it was heavily borrowed from Latin in the Middle Ages through scholarly works and documents and like the church and like the monks translate. So like a lot of these long multisyllabic words come from that avenue.
Yeah.
Like they're like learned terms, not like organic terms used by the average.
Yes, yeah. I remember I read this book about a year ago, Norman Davies' Europe, a History, I believe is what it was titled. And it suggested that the French way of speaking in the medieval era was sort of the sophisticated, how they sort of drop a few letter sounds, and this was sort of just the sophisticated, sort of laid back. I wouldn't say
prestige language.
Yeah, it was a prestige way of speaking. I wouldn't say it's like sprezzatura, like we talked about, which is this notion of sort of laid back, studied indifference, which is, it doesn't mean you're actually indifferent, but you have this studied indifference. But I think just pointing that out to show that I think that the educated elite guided the way that the language went in medieval Europe, and that's ultimately what became sort of the documented the language as well. And what was taught in schools and ultimately pervades as received pronunciation. I put
Sure.
that in quotation marks as
Yeah.
analogous. To,
Yeah.
yeah.
Because like real received pronunciation, like the modern British accent that they use now, only really started in the early 1800s, I think, because
Right,
like the royal family kind of used it, and it was imitated by like influential people.
But in some sense, you kind of have like King Charles and his family speak somewhat differently from a BBC broadcaster,
Yeah, sure,
which speaks somewhat distinctively differently from a Cockney accent.
Yeah.
Or the new evolution of Cockney accents that you all have told me about, which speaks differently from someone from York, right?
Oh
Or
yeah, 'cause
Southern England.
The UK arguably has more variety of accents than the United States does for how
Yeah.
small it is. It's been around longer. English has been there longer, so they kind of
Yes.
organically develop in each of these like shires, you know.
But it's interesting you say that. I feel like there is this huge distinction, like you said, in the different shires in England. But I heard this audio series lecture from like Modern Scholar by a professor named Michael C. Drought on English, and he said, in theory, you can pick up like what's the mid-Ohio accent and distinguish that from different parts of Ohio.
Sure,
and
I
of
mean,
course you have
depends
like
how
Texas
detailed
twang.
you get, yeah,
Like
yeah.
you have the Western Texas twang, and then you have East Texas twang, and then you have kind of this Dallas accent. And they're sort of disappearing, I would say, because you know they everything is sort of being blended in by CBS Hollywood accents that we hear. And it's curious. Even Eastern Washington State has like
Yeah,
a different
sure.
accent
I mean,
than Western Washington.
Of course, all
State.
kinds of little micro. I mean, there's like that thing called the Tidewater accent in North Carolina on the Outer Banks in that area.
Yes,
It's
yes.
called the Hoy-Toider accent because it almost sounds. Some people think it sounds almost like Australian or vaguely Irish, but it's actually supposed to be developed from Elizabethan era
Yes.
in English. It just became
Yes.
isolated there. It didn't really change.
There's
It
certain
doesn't even
islands
sound like
on-
American, but
Yeah, yeah.
it's very American.
And they sort of maintain that Elizabethan
Yeah.
pronunciation.
But it's almost
Certain-
dying off. Like the younger generation don't really speak anymore.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to notice about especially our societal structures and geographic distributions of dialects, which creates this, disparity in the way UK accents are and the United States accents are. Because if you think about the old British society, and I guess, to some extent even today, but there was a lot more stratification. Everyone had their kind of place. There was a lot more use of like manners and social awareness at parties, and who's above you and who's below you.
Right.
And
exactly hierarchy. Yeah.
Yes, and your father, you'll be pretty much adopting the same trade as your father to some extent for many centuries, and you'll be living in the same area for many centuries. So now that makes sense why the UK is such a small geographic area. I mean, it's something like similar to the size of France, but we look at all these little drastic accent changes in very short distances in a matter of kilometers.
I know, right?
And here in the United States, your son or your father or your grandson will be in Ohio, the other one will be in California, because we as independent spirited individuals have no regard for our societal position.
Yeah.
Everyone has their own choice and they can move wherever they want. So all of our accents also disperse much more rapidly to the great
Very
extents
true,
of the
yeah.
continent.
It's interesting you say that, though. I just to push back mildly, I totally agree that in certain aspects of American culture we don't have this hierarchy. Just pointing to the book Albion Seed.
Yes.
The author says the Cavaliers who settled in Virginia and set up the plantation system, they had a very rigid hierarchy system. Like you knew who was above you and things like that. But the Puritans in Massachusetts Bay Colony, they had it not necessarily because they intended to have a more egalitarian system. It was more about the Calvinistic principles that they were based on. You didn't have these massive landowners, so there wasn't this huge hierarchical system. There was a hierarchy, but it wasn't as huge. And the thing is, maybe the U.S. is just, we have this whole mix of things. We have certain subcultures that have hierarchies. I mean, certainly in a corporation you do. But we kind of have this mystique that we're all equal at the same time, and that we can, like you said, be going all over the country. One person, your dad can live in Ohio, the son lives in California, the brother in New York, and things like that. But I mean, again, I feel like in some sense that might lead to dispersion to just having a uniform accent in general, which is what we seem to be tending towards.
Well, and I find it interesting what you were commenting about the Cavaliers being more like land owning, and when you own land, that ties your family and your economic and your revenue to a specific place. I'm not sure if the Puritans were in the Northeast. If my history is correct, that's more of like the more of where the manufacturing engine of the United States was in the 1800s. That allows for more freedom of movement, this kind of society. And I feel like after the Civil War, the Puritans might have, culture might have taken a little bit more of the power and attention of the nation. But I'm curious as what the author has to say about which of those, four cultures is more prominent in today's society and has more of a sway.
Well, I will say a couple things. One is he admits from that first chapter that I quoted at in the beginning that this is an empirical study and it can be falsified. So he says, of course, there's a lot of evidence that you could present against this. It doesn't necessarily have to be for British Folkways. There could be there's Mexican influence. There's actually French influence in Louisiana. So there is evidence he admits that you could present as pushing back on this. And so the thing is, I agree with you in some sense that after the Civil War, things changed quite a bit. I mean, there were sort of these representations of cultures. I think that they spread across the United States. The Cavaliers were always like a very small minority, but they had large assets, so they sort of had like the collection of things. The book actually doesn't focus a lot in the beginning of the book on the 1800s. It focuses on like the 1600s and 1700s when these migratory patterns were occurring. So therefore, like factory and industrialization hadn't really come in yet. But the seeds and the germs that ended up leading to that were definitely existed in the Puritan areas, which is like Massachusetts Bay, New England, Northeast area. And I mean, some of it is environmental too. Like you can't have large scale plantations in Massachusetts because the weather just really doesn't permit for that, as it does in like the Chesapeake Bay area.
It's interesting though, like so the hierarchy thing. I mean, even in the geographic area of the South, you get like different accents based on that. So like Cavaliers, the gentry, probably were the ones that originated that like kind of Southern aristocrat, like talking like father, like that kind of like where they don't fully pronounce the R. The thing that Bear mentioned earlier about the R's being pronounced fully at the end of words is called rhoticism. In phonetics. So that came from like the Celtic, like Scottish and Irish, that pattern, which became kind of bigger in Appalachia, but also among more of the lower class in the South that were in the same geographic area as the landed gentry, which had probably a different accent, right? So that kind of is reflected, within a geographic area, right? Like and some of those speech patterns, I guess, fell kind of way into like even African American vernacular as
we've done a podcast
Thomas,
on that. Thomas Sowell's Black Rednecks and White Liberals book basically picks up on one of these migratory patterns, the Scotch Irish. And I think that was a really fun podcast we did.
Oh, I'm sorry to jump in here. We talked a bit about the Puritans and about the Cavaliers. Can you also bring up a bit of the accent influences that we see with the other two migratory groups that I was mentioned in the book?
Yeah, so just going in chronological order, the big Puritan migration occurred first. Even though Virginia was founded first, the big migration didn't occur there first. There was just a small settlement. So the Puritans went there first, then the Cavaliers with their indentured servants went to Virginia, Chesapeake area, Maryland. And then you had the Quakers, which went to the Delaware Valley and New Jersey. And then you have the Scotch Irish. So the Quakers who went up there were from the Midlands, and they had like a slightly different accent, which we would maybe compare more to like a York accent, more Northern English accent, and they incorporated these speech patterns. Not necessarily, there was certainly an accent, but they also had ways of speaking. The way a Quaker assembly met. They were called friends with a capital F, like we are friends is a synonym for Quakers. they would have these very slow ways of speaking, and there would be visitors from like Sweden. I was reading, there was a visitor from Sweden. Someone took 7 minutes to say one sentence. They would say one word, wait for 30 seconds, say the next word. And that's just the nature of Quaker meetings. And it would be quiet, or it'd be like a jumble of words. And because you didn't necessarily have like a preacher or sermon at the time, as did the Puritans or like the Anglican Cavaliers, so, which would influence language, because like the Puritans were very like textually based, and they wanted to bring in lots of Latinisms and have like an academic speech which pervade into like the normal speech of the Puritans, and they'd be like throwing in these lackadaisical words and like big words in to normal speech. But the Quakers would almost have this like fragmented way of speaking sometimes, because basically you would stand up, anyone could stand up, and they would just like say something, whether it's a prayer for society, or they would just say like, I, 30 seconds later, pray, 30 seconds later, 30 seconds later, God, and you would just wait for it to wrap up. And as I mentioned, there would be there was a Swedish visitor who said you couldn't even understand what they were saying. But that's the nature of Quaker meeting, which is one of the segments of the Protestant Reformation. And I imagine it's somewhat different, going back to your point of Spain. Spain had a unified religion, and there weren't these segments that were allowed to go. And they had the Spanish Inquisition. They kept a tight control on the Catholic tradition. But in Albion Seed, these 4 British Folkways, I mean, you have like the Puritans. That's very Calvinistic. The Anglicans are almost like Anglo-Catholic in a way, a manner of speaking, like they have a very ornate ritual. The Quakers are completely different. They're not Calvinists, but they have like kind of this different theology. And then the Scotch-Irish are from like the border region and Ireland, as you mentioned.
Yes.
Because some of them were English or Scots that went to Ireland,
Scots,
and then they moved to the Americas. So they started off there, and then they brought their accents as well. And that's like kind of the accent that we would often associate as country, not this laid back like Alabama accent, like, oh, would you please go to the garden and pick up something for me? Something you'd seen like Gone with the Wind movie. But kind of like, how you doing, boy? Good to see you. Very nice. Yeah. So I think you can see like a distinction there between like kind of a high Southern aristocratic, aristocratic vernacular, and just like this country, vernacular.
What we call like hick, but
In a manner of speaking, I mean, I think with Dukes of Hazzard, they almost embodied the Scotch Irish.
I kind of like that kind of accent.
Yeah, I like that kind of accent. Yeah.
But it is interesting what you're talking about, these religious disparities as well. Like
I mean, keep going.
Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really considered much about how the Catholic Church, in its domination of the Spanish religion, would influence a religious pattern. But I guess it could affect settlement patterns, right? Because I guess you have 4 different groups with 4 different religious patterns. They're not really like reporting to each other and telling you, well, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go here. It seems like maybe the Spanish colonization pattern was a little bit more centralized, but I could be wrong. How do you think that those religious differences affected the development of the English language in the United States?
Well, I mean, certainly I think they did have a big influence on this because, like I mentioned, the Calvinists were very textually oriented. A big thing that John Calvin and Martin Luther in the 1500s, which is like 70 to 100 years prior to the events in this book starting, they really focused on like textual analysis, just focusing solely on the text of like the Bible itself. It's just something I think a St. John's alumnus would really resonate with. But they were using like the latest techniques in textual analysis. They were somewhat, disenchanted with the Catholic tradition and how it sort of, in their mind, moved away from the original Christianity as they saw it. Mm-hmm. So I would say Puritans and Calvinists really focused on text. They were very academically oriented. In fact, they almost had like 100% literacy, is what this book suggested, in the 1600s and early 1700s. So that influences a lot of things later on, like abolition, industrialization, and things like that. They really focused. They wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible. Anglicans didn't really focus on that much. The Scotch-Irish didn't really focus on that as much. And so that definitely is a major thing. Like if your religion is telling you everyone needs to read the Bible and do it well, that's going to be different than like the Anglicans or the Church of England, effectively speaking. They say, well, you don't need to know it all.
You need to profess your faith, but not necessarily interpret what you're professing to.
Yeah, so I would say that ultimately, in a large way, like influences how people speak, and likewise, Quakers were Protestants, but they weren't as focused on the text as Puritans. And in fact, everyone had a voice in the assembly, and they could stand up and maybe not very well articulate themselves, but since it's being done in front of God, it's okay. And while on the other hand, you sort of had like this hierarchy, whether it's Cotton Mather or something, or John Winthrop, it's like very down, like, no, this is like, we need to really focus on religion. In fact, another interesting point is New England had a ton of universities and colleges that it founded prior to the Revolution in 1776. Virginia had a few, such as William and Mary, and St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland, where
1693, right?
1696, I believe, right?
Yes.
So, like the Chesapeake Bay area, which this book kind of combines Maryland and Virginia as the Chesapeake Bay area, had like colleges there, but only one college was founded in Philadelphia, that whole Delaware region, because they didn't really focus on education as much as compared to the Puritans, who were all gung ho about it.
Right,
the
Harvard
Harvard. I mean, there were there are a ton of like colleges focused on that, and while on the other hand, Virginia focused on it for just the elite, because one thing it said, like the meeting houses in Massachusetts really valued libraries, public education, everyone giving in, pitching in money for schools. The Virginia elite, most people didn't have access to books. Yes, you had these grand libraries of plantations that were rumored around the world, like these fantastic libraries, but those weren't open to the public. That was open to like the Cavaliers, basically, the small elite population that were basically aristocratic nobility.
Like Lord Baltimore, for example.
Lord
His
Baltimore.
awesome flag, which is still the flag of Maryland today.
That's his flag.
It has that kind of old, or almost like medieval kind of look. Yeah.
I love it. Yeah, I mean, you could see that in a medieval battlefield, and it would fit in, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But does that kind of answer your question, or
No,
what do you think about that?
Definitely, yeah. I do see some a lot of influences and their I guess textual like tendencies for textual analysis within the church, as well as their tendencies like and stress on education and how the like linguistic patterns could develop within these four cultural groups. But I was just thinking back to like Spanish, right? Like you had a lot more, in contrast with like the English colonization patterns, where it's just as the colonists move westward, you're just constantly pushing out the native cultures. Like it was very much an immersion within the Spanish culture, right? Like even to this day, in Paraguay they have two national languages. They have Spanish and Guarani, and everyone speaks both of those languages. And throughout Peru, you have a lot of communities of Quechua, where there's millions of speakers, and many different regions in Mexico have.
I will say Andrei and I went to Chichen Itza in the Yucatan Peninsula and in the state of Yucatan and maybe some neighboring states. The Yucatec Maya language is one of the official languages.
Yeah, you would see it on all the signs and things like that.
Yeah.
Some things are in Spanish, but also in Maya.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Just further reinforcing.
Yes, no, and it's so interesting. Like I just think about just various words, right? Like throughout almost all of Latin America, like an avocado is aguacate, but if you go to Peru and I think maybe Bolivia, they say palta. And I think that's a Quechua word. And then
where did avocado, the word, come from?
I'm not sure of its origin. That's a great question. But you do see a lot of like variations in just every single country in almost all of Latin America has their own word for straw. Right, like I think in Mexico it's like popote. Some places they say sorbete, and it's
like a sipping straw.
Yes, and in Spain they say pajilla.
Like paja, paji, it's smaller. Paja.
like a
It's
straw. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So so many different varieties of just one singular word, and it becomes so complex, and especially when you think of how much mixing there was with like native languages with their dialect of Spanish, like how you say like dude, like someone you're talking to, like as a friend, right? In Spain you'll say tío. In Mexico you'll say way. In Peru you'll say causa. Like it's just there's so many varieties where it becomes overwhelming. So now you don't just have like the four migratory groups. You also have to consider as factors how the accents are, or the grammatical or vocabulary patterns are impacted by the native groups that were there already, right?
Yeah.
And
it's complicated.
Yeah, it gets complicated. So it's not as much as complicated as differences in religious groups, but as much more complicated in terms of a mixing of cultures.
Exactly.
Exactly.
It's interesting you mentioned that. This book briefly mentions it. In other books I've read, like Neil Ferguson, I think in his Empire book, or maybe it was another book that I read by Neil Ferguson, but he said that both Neil Ferguson and in Albion Seed, they said that when men came to Massachusetts Bay Colony, they also brought like almost nearly an equal amount of women. So like the men weren't worried about having to effectively mix in with the native population. But on the other hand, in Spain, New Spain, it was mostly male immigrants, so they were almost forced to mix in with the native cultures. And I wonder if that influences the language as well.
Yeah,
almost invariably. Yeah. Because I mean, if
they were like adventurers, conquistadors, opportunities.
Yes.
They were searching for gold and bounty, and
Yeah.
it required kind of rougher men that were more. You wouldn't really bring your family.
Yes.
Initially, later some did, but like I don't think it was nearly as much as New England and.
Yeah, and I also see a heavy contrast. So it's so interesting that in a country like Spain. Or maybe even French with the French colonization of Africa, but that's a whole different animal, right?
Wow.
Because I mean, with French like presence in Africa, most of the African countries that still speak French, of course, it will be one national language, but it's almost invariable that most of the people, like households, speak another language between the family members, But they just did not. I don't know if it was a policy of the government or they just did not have that long of a time compared to the 400 years Spain had in Latin America. The French only had their colonies for about 90 years, something like this,
It's interesting because Paris also keeps a tight control on the French language.
Yes,
like
Académie Française.
Like this is the standard French, which we don't have in English. Right?
No, we don't, and Spain does as well. They have the Real Academia del Español. And that,
RAE, it's a good website to consult for etymology.
All the time. But it's so strange that the English did not want to mix with the native groups, but they don't care about having
language,
a control on their language.
Yeah.
Well, the Spanish will mix with all of the cultures, but they want a type.
Language is also a tool of the empire in some ways. So keeping it like a uniform, prescriptive kind of register of the language is important in being able to rule.
Yes.
But at the same time, linguistic differences, as we've seen, reinforce hierarchical divisions as well, which in New Spain, I guess, was important because it had almost like castes in a way. So I guess there's, it seems contradictory. So I don't know. What do you think?
It's a great it's a great point. I feel like I don't know about what's really the impact of this kind of hierarchical division and using language as a tool to reinforce that hierarchy is I'm tempted to look at some of the languages that were minority languages in the respective the peninsula and the Isles, right? You have in Spain, I would need to study more of the British Isles, but in Spain you have the Valencian and the Catalan languages.
It's like a different language.
A completely different language of Spanish. I mean, it's all the same family, but
right.
Basque is
a
completely different
related
animal, and those did not, make their way into the New World, and they did not make a presence. And
for the most part, maybe
for the most
a
part,
few regions, but
But you will see like an example of like, for example, Franco, the dictator who ruled Spain from the late 30s until the 70s, was suppressing even the languages within the Spanish Peninsula, right? You
like Gallego,
Gallego,
Asturiano, and also.
Yes, Valenciano. You have people that stopped speaking Valenciano, and most of that community is being lost. While on the other hand, you have in Catalonia, almost the entire population speaks Catalan because they're so independent oriented, you know. So you see, even within the places where these languages originated, they're still suppressing those local languages for power. So you might, maybe in Catalonia, you might really identify with someone who spoke like Nahuatl or like Quechua, because you know what it feels like for your language to be put down.
That's true. It's interesting that in a lot of these European countries, there used to be a lot more regional languages. Like in France, in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, there's all these other, like these things that we listed. Castellano was only one of many.
It was from Asturias and that Castilla y León.
Yeah, the León, and then that became the dominant thing. And in France, the area around Paris became the dominant, because there was Occitan in the south, like Gonçal, which is closer to Catalan actually. And then, you know, Aquitanian, Bordeaux, there's Picard, Norman, you know,
Burgundy, you could say the same with the British Isles
Italy
as well.
too, there's like all kinds of, like Sicilian, Venetian, Friulian, Ligurian, you know.
And I mean, you could even have Greek dialects. You could have the British, like picked in Scotland.
Yeah, but I'm saying it's interesting how like the homelands in the old world have all these like patchwork of little ones, and then it's mostly like one dominant one that brings it to the new world, and then it's only out of that one that everything else, all the local dialects here kind of form.
Yeah, and
there's less variety in some ways.
It's so cool. I've thought about it like in some sense like biological traits. Like I don't know what I think it would be a phenotype, right? When you talk about like an organism, right? You take a certain trait, and that's just like the most dominant one, right? Like I don't know if you had this is kind of a strange metaphor, but if you had a bunch of moths, right? Like they had a lot of moths in the Industrial Revolution, where like when they had these white moths, and then they start introducing smog, right? They all get killed off because of the birds, and then the one black one survived, right? And that reproduces, and then that whole phenotype gets taken to one place, and it spreads.
Yes, yep.
I think that's a great analogy. Yes,
it's called a bottleneck effect, or like a founder effect.
Yes.
Yeah. It's utterly fascinating, and it's almost as if within a culture, like we have a biological evaluation of linguistic patterns where it's like your language does not deserve to be passed on, and that we're either decide, like if you're a dominant group, we decide not to pass it on by ostracizing people, forcing them to change their phenotype essentially, or not mating with that population or going to war with them.
Kind of selection, I guess.
So it's so interesting how integral that has become to our societies.
Yeah, but I'm all for the kind of preserving these little dialects and dying kind of languages and things like that. I think it's just fascinating. It adds more diversity, and to the world. But unfortunately, like a lot of them are just dying out because they can't compete with the big ones, and like in all over Europe, there's all these tiny little kind of languages, that have like a few thousand speakers. That I think it's very important.
Well, you could say the same thing about African languages, languages in Asia, in the Americas. But do you guys have concluding thoughts, maybe, that we could start wrapping this up?
Or for sure. I mean, I don't know. Just it's an interesting topic. I mean, definitely has a lot of. You can see how these kind of trends affected, like, not only like modern American speech patterns, but also just like the culture, like our ideas, our thinking, our national sort of personalities, so to speak. And
Yeah.
It's really interesting how you kind of
Philosophically, it's interesting. It seems like language can almost reflect your consciousness, and your consciousness gets reflected in language, and almost the way you grow up speaking, whether it's dialect or language, that can almost like influence who you are as a person, just in terms of your thought process. I mean, you're smiling, Bear. What do you think about that?
I like think there's so many like psychological implications, but I was just thinking about in terms of societies and interaction between different culture groups. You see such an interesting development of different accent patterns, like the rhoticism is one thing we mentioned, and in Spanish, right, you have like the double L sound, which in some regions you pronounce in certain ways, and in other regions you pronounce in other ways depending on the immigration patterns of the people, and it says such interesting implications for what our language will have in the future, what we can predict, and the interaction of our society even today. And now we add another little blot of ink into a pot of water when you start integrating AI to this concept, right? Technology creating language to talk to each other, so they'll hide themselves from humanity. Or maybe it could even accelerate the development of a new language as AI starts predicting where it's going to go and beats us to this development. So that's something I haven't even thought about, but I would love to consider.
That is a fascinating.
Yeah.
What's interesting though is that languages before they were written down, and then especially before we had modern mass educations, evolved more quickly because they were passed on only orally. So every person that passed it on might have changed it like a little bit, and they kind of split off from the other kind of kin group, and it developed on their own. Now with standardization, it changes, at least in official form, a lot more slowly.
Yeah.
However, with the rise of the internet, you have like slang and things like that, and like subcultures practicing. Every generation, every kind of decade has its own new words, so that's like a competing trend.
But it's interesting you say that when you have an illiterate population or that can't read. What's interesting, we've talked about it in another podcast, that there were studies in the 1920s of the singers of tales in the Balkans who mimicked the Indo-European patterns that existed from Homeric times, and they recited poems and they recorded them in the 1920s from this illiterate population in the Balkans in the mountains, and they had the exact same rhyme pattern as you see in Homeric epics from like 2,000 years ago, or beyond 2,000 years ago.
Even if the language is different, the structure is oddly kind of mirrored.
Yeah.
And I had this thought a long time ago. It was about the development of, like, in the restriction of linguistic growth. It seems like you have certain periods of time in which different classes of society have control over the language. You have the educated class, at least after standardization became more widely spread, controls the language until the common class has changed the language so much that they're no longer mutually intelligible. And then at that point, which is not really a black and white line, it's kind of a gray area, the common class takes control of the language and keeps modifying it until they can come up with a structure of rules. And then the educated class takes control of it again. So it's almost like the linguistic control and regulation has a kind of sinusoidal curve, going through. It's utterly fascinating.
I mean, we could go on for like hours about this. This is one of my favorite topics.
It is.
I'm very grateful that you guys invited me.
We're very thankful to have Bear come to our podcast.
Thank you so much.
Coming here, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, which is the mantra that we use here.
I hope you guys actually have some good comments on this one. This is an interesting topic. So,
den me gusta y suscríbanse.
Muchas gracias, padre.
You guys covered.
Thank you. All right.
Signing off.
Signing off.